so much of this movement is young. It's millennials, the largest generation in history, most diverse and progressive generation in history, approaching 40 years old with, experienced everything from wars to recessions to the economic crisis of 2008 to 9/11. And you have the Zoomers who are now going to be experiencing this extraordinary circumstance without the leader that they have seen mostly in their adult lives, which is Bernie Sanders, take the lead in the movement. I think millennials like myself, we lost trust in the establishment, the Democratic establishment, when we saw Tim Geithner brought in right after the economic collapse, and much of what we were facing was not dealt with under the Democratic administration. And so, I mean, where do we go from here? Where does this generation, how do we organize? How do we defeat the establishment that flexed their muscles so hard to defeat us?
Well, look, a few weeks ago, you and I spoke of what would FDR do, right? And we spoke of that in hopes that Bernie Sanders was going to step forth and might actually, in light of the crisis, become the nominee, or at least that was the hope we might have shared. Look, we don't have an FDR today, obviously. We don't even have a Hoover, okay? Nor do we have the prospect of an FDR, okay? I mean, the least worst scenario is a Biden presidency. Did I say that right? The least worst scenario?
Yep.
Yeah. So, but here's the thing. My work, everyone thinks that I'm the FDR scholar, which maybe I am. But I wrote about FDR and what we call the greatest generation. And those folks were young, okay, in the 30s. They were 15-year-olds and 20-year-olds, and they made FDR great. And the thing is that they rallied and they mobilized. And I'll start off in the silliest of ways, which I may have mentioned to you. I know I've said to a few people. I mean, if you look back at the 30s, and it was miserable, and hundreds of thousands of young people were on the road just because their parents couldn't even keep them. Yeah. And they were lucky enough to have a president who was willing to mobilize their energies and all that. But it's also the case that there's a lot of energy amongst young people. And I don't, look, this crisis has yet to be figured out fully. But part of the figuring out is made a little bit easier because we have all of this social media. I mean, folks who are in their 20s and their 30s or even their teens have to realize that they're empowered in a way that other generations were not. And so, for example, I mean, the last couple of weeks, I think I was telling you before, young people, I do podcasts and radio and all that, and I have to be a good 30 years older than every one of the people that I'm dealing with, and I'm always impressed. Look, I mean, I'm concerned about whether or not we all can get our act together, whatever our ages, but I'm really impressed by the energy that exists. So, and by the way, and there's this multi-tiered kind of sort of, and I don't even want to call it alternative. I want to call it new media. So I do a radio show with a community group in New Orleans, or a podcast with a group that calls itself Highlands Bunker in Baltimore. I mean, so all across the country, there are these things.
Yeah.
As well as folks like you. I mean, you have a good reputation. Your following is going to grow. Michael Brooks, who's a dear friend, and his show is just literally exploding, you might say. And Majority Report seems to be, really thriving. Not to mention, we've got Rising in the Morning. Okay, we've got Majority Report midday, which I've come to really make my midday scene, and then the Young Turks. And I know when I say that, everybody has their favorites and they'll scorn any one of those, but let's face it, I mean, there is this really thriving alternative media. I didn't even want to say alternative, but new media. Now, but on the same scale as cable news, well, nobody watching cable news anyhow. I mean, it's an addiction. It's not really something people do to learn very much, or at least I can't imagine they do. The mainstream media, I don't even know if it exists any longer, what we think of as mainstream media. So the thing is, we're really well positioned. I say we, because I'm not young, but we're really well positioned to create something. But the question is, can we create it in a way so that it doesn't become, because we cannot afford fragmentation right now. We can't afford splintering. We can't afford arguing over terminologies. Okay, even though I have my preferred terminology, we can't afford to argue over that. we have to realize that we are at this moment. You know, just back in the 30s, Harry Hopkins said, "We can't waste a crisis." And I hate to quote, what's his name? Who was
Rahm Emanuel, who stole it.
He said we can't waste a crisis, but he wasted everything, basically. Yeah. But the thing is, we can't waste this crisis. And it is important that we create some kind of united left or popular front left. And in doing so, we should also try to imagine the ways of using media. You know, I'll tell you something very interesting. I have no idea what will come of it. So I was on Rising last week, or maybe it was even this week. Everything's running together. And I happened to mention the idea that, or maybe I mentioned it to you as well, that we have to think in terms of putting on a show, perhaps. And somebody heard me say that, and they contacted me from California today. Somebody whose husband was for a while a co-director of Second City in Chicago, and said, let's talk about what the possibilities are. So it strikes me that right in this moment, there are possibilities. And whether or not we can pull it off will hang on your generation's sort of energies and creativities and your willingness to reach out, basically, and pull people in. So I don't know if I'm being clear about that, but that to me is what this moment is about. I've been thinking about this afternoon in particular. This has been on my mind for a while. I grew up in the New York area. So I love New York. I love Brooklyn. I love New Jersey. I love the whole area. I want to make that clear. But it is.
I love Astoria.
There you go.
Sorry.
It's funny, when I'm back in New York a lot, I used to say way out in Astoria, but I won't go there right now.
Progressive haven.
Okay, so here's the thing. The thing is, however, is that out here in Wisconsin, where I've lived now for 40 years as a professor and, you know, a left person, I always say to myself, I'm really, really tired of the fact that the left voice that we get nationally is out of the East.
Right.
Or, in the case of TYT, the West.
LA, yeah.
Now, I know you're in Arizona right now, but I assume as things improve, you may well leave. What I want to know is, and I know there have to be, I know there are podcasters out here. I know there are people, but how do we create it so when we say national, we don't just mean it goes national, but how do we get the Midwestern perspective into these kinds of media? How do we do that? So in some ways, the idea of a network isn't a bad idea. But if somebody wants to develop that network, not for the idea of television, for the idea of these sort of social media sites, we've got to figure out a way so that the Midwest is represented and the voices are heard. This is just something that's been on my mind today, okay? I mean, we've got big cities here too. We've got Chicago.
Jacobin's out of Chicago. I mean, a lot of, there's, In These Times, I mean, isn't it In These Times out of Chicago?
In These Times is, yes.
Yeah.
But, right, and it's been around for an awfully long time, and I can tell you that it would be I feared the possibility years ago that In These Times might not survive, and it is doing very well. But what I'm getting at is not just in the print media that we need more. Like Michael's in Brooklyn, and you're going to be back in New York, and Majority Report is out of New York, and Crystal is by way of Rising is down in DC. There ought to be something more. This isn't a lament. This is a call.
Well, some of these hosts, I mean, just to play it fair, because I think I want to talk more about just electorally how we move forward in the movement. That's okay, because Human Rights Report, David Dole's out of Toronto. There are people who are out of different places that have big followings.
Human Rights Report is great. That's Portland.
Portland, yeah. Right. No, but David Dole's out of Toronto, who's Rational National. So, there are people who are doing incredible work that are in other pockets of the country. Keeping that in mind, moving forward with demographics, if COVID doesn't change things, most people do live in cities. And I understand why that is a big perspective, but we also, as New York, we have a very different type of politics that is focused on demographics. You know that as a New Yorker, as a former New Yorker, that the way that they carve up districts is based on ethnic neighborhoods. And so you'll hear about this vote and that vote and this vote. And then it becomes part of the rhetoric. Like, I need to appeal to X, Y, Z, and you're not appealing to this. And so then you have this identity, the identity factions kind of playing against each other in some scenarios or working with each other. Yeah. But that doesn't work for national politics. And I think that's kind of what you're hinting at here, is that Bernie may have gotten a little bit off that.
Right.
You know?
No, but let's face it. I mean, the Democrats lost Wisconsin, Michigan. I mean, something has to happen.
They also didn't go there. So.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that very term, there are two terms that I utterly, I despise hearing. Flyover country and the Rust Belt.
Oh.
Sorry.
I'm from Buffalo, so that's about as Rust Belt as you could get. Thank you for watching. You can support The Nomiki Show on YouTube by clicking subscribe, like, and sharing. Because as you guys know, now more than ever, we have to support our independent media. We are being attacked from every angle, and everyone's watching CNN every night, so it's important that we take care of the good guys fighting the fight. You can also join us on Patreon for special content and interviews. We also have swag like these new mugs, starting as low as $5 a month, which is, basically what an iced coffee is in Manhattan when we had iced coffee shops open. You can go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show.